So a pleasant good afternoon to everyone. My name is Priscilla Liebert-Calder. I'm the event coordinator for the NJSBDC at Rutgers-Newark, and on behalf of Dr. Tendai Ndoro, our regional director, I would like to welcome you to our webinar on cybersecurity. For those of you who are not familiar with the Small Business Development Centers, we are a resource center for the United States Small Business Administration, and we are the premier provider of business training and consulting services given to established small businesses and startups across New Jersey, more particularly for those that reside in Essex County, New Jersey. We are one of 12 centers in the NJSBDC network, each center being responsible for one or multiple counties. And our center is hosted by the Rutgers Business School and funded through a partnership agreement between the SBA, Rutgers University, and the New Jersey Business Action Center. The goal of the SBDC is to help entrepreneurs and business owners start and grow successful and sustainable businesses. And we do this by offering no cost, confidential, one-on-one business consulting, and also offering training and technical assistance programs such as workshops and the webinars that you are attending here today. To take advantage of our one-on-one consulting services, you simply just need to request that service, and you can do that by visiting any one of our websites, whether it's njsbdc.com or rnsbdc.com. And when you get to those websites, simply click on the button that says request counseling or get started. And once you complete that form, we will then receive it, assign you a consultant in the area or a consultant that has the expertise that you're looking for. And within 24 to 48 hours, they do reach out to do an assessment or to do that one-on-one session. We have consultants with expertise in various areas. It can be anything from marketing to cybersecurity to import-export to accessing capital, government contracting and procurement, any possible topic that you can think about. We have many consultants on our team, and even if we don't have a consultant in an area in which you need help, we are a part of a network where we can find someone with that expertise to schedule your one-on-one. So please do take advantage of that service. Again, you can visit any of our websites, www.rnsbdc.com. I'll post that into the chat, and we'll assign you as soon as possible. For the benefit of those attending today's webinar, audio has been muted. So we'll be taking questions via the chat or the Q&A section here. So please feel free to post any questions, and we'll do our best to respond either during or at the end of the presentation. A copy of today's presentation slide, along with a video replay of today's webinar, will be emailed out within 48 to 72 hours of the end of the presentation. All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter for today, Michelle Schaap. Michelle Schaap is one of our consultants here at the Rutgers-Newark SBDC, specializing in cybersecurity. And I just don't want to butcher the name of her practice, so I'll let her do that and tell you a little bit more about herself and get into today's presentation. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Priscilla, and good afternoon, everybody. The firm's name is Chiesa, Shahinian, and Giantomasi. Please use CSG, it's much easier. Now, what's interesting is Priscilla mentioned what the SBDC is for, and that is to help and support small businesses. The problem is that small businesses often don't see themselves as a target for cyber issues. They say, oh, I'm too small. Nobody cares about me. Why would they bother? But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, because I am a lawyer, of course, we have to have a legal disclaimer. And that is that while I am here to provide information to you, I'm not acting as your counsel. If you choose to engage with me through the SBDC, then I can provide to you specific counsel and guidance for your business. That said, small businesses and large businesses, for that matter, are in fact a target. And as this quote shares with you, there are two types of businesses: ones that have been compromised, those which don't know it yet. And that's a scary proposition. And some of you may have heard an expression called dwell time. Dwell time means how long bad actors have been lurking in your systems, but you don't know it as yet. And when we talk about data breaches, timing is everything. To me, one of the scariest stats that I read was about the Dominion National breach, in which it took 9 years for Dominion National to discover that it had been compromised. To me, that is mind-boggling. That said, the average breach continues for at least 6 months before it is detected. And that means that it's been detected. Doesn't mean that the compromise has ceased. It just means that somebody knows something is going on. And how you contain and eradicate a breach takes time, it takes money, it takes effort. So needless to say, the sooner that you find out that you have been compromised, the more quickly you can get back to the business of your business. But to take the position that you're too small to be a compromise is a very dangerous view of the world. And in fact, small businesses, I would suggest, are often perceived by bad actors as the low-hanging fruit. And I'll give you a very simple example before we get deeper into this discussion. You and your neighbor live next door to each other. You're on the same block, presumably same types of resources, otherwise you wouldn't live in the same neighborhood. You each drive a nice car, you each have nice things and what have you. Your neighbor goes out and buys a dog. You don't have a dog. Well, if you're a burglar and you come up to the two houses and he approaches your neighbor's house and hears a dog barking, odds are good he's going to go rob your house instead. It's that simple. One step, one layer makes you a less attractive target. If you're wondering why you should be doing this, aside from the fact that presumably you care about your business and the integrity of your data, there are a number of risks and exposures that your business faces if you don't prepare. Your reputation. Now, I'm going back to a little bit of ancient history when we're talking about cybersecurity and data breaches, but I'm willing to bet that for those of you that remember the Target breach, you were reluctant to go back into a Target store or to shop online, at least initially after that compromise occurred. If you had a Yahoo account at the time when they finally decided to disclose to the rest of the world that Yahoo had one of, at the time, the largest breaches ever recorded, my guess is you might have switched from Yahoo to Gmail or to any other resource other than Yahoo. Those companies had reputational damage. And if you remember from high school days, it was really good to have a terrific reputation today and to lose it the next day. And once you've got a bad reputation, gaining that trust back, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about reputation, you're now trying to get back the trust of your customers and your personnel, and for that matter, law enforcement. And it's not easy to rebuild trust. You've got regulatory risk. I will tell you right now that if you are a business in the state of New Jersey and you have a breach and you don't report that breach within the time frame required by the state of New Jersey, you could be subject to fines for failure to report in a timely manner. I don't know if any of you read, but Zoom just settled with the FTC. And when we think about regulatory enforcement, if any of you have a website and on your website you have a privacy policy that says, in so many words, we guarantee your security, A, you can't guarantee it. And B, that statement alone is an FTC violation. Now, Zoom was cited not with, or rather in the settlement that was announced, it didn't include a financial fine, which frankly surprised me, although my guess is there's still litigation playing out in the private sector. However, what the FTC is requiring Zoom to do is to implement new policies and procedures and report to the FTC for the next 20 years. That's a very long time to have the federal government in your business's shorts and looking over your shoulder, literally. Operational risk. If God forbid you have a compromise, your personnel who are supposed to be working on managing your accounts, drumming up new business, and otherwise doing their day-to-day jobs are being distracted. They're being pulled away to help you to respond to the breach, to recover from the breach, to answer to regulators, to answer to customers. And by the way, operationally, and this ties into internal morale, employees are saying, yeah, they've had a data breach. That doesn't give me the warm and fuzzies. Does that mean that my social security number as one of your employees has been compromised? Does that mean that my family member's information has been compromised because I got my health care through your business? So when we think about operational risk, that also ties into your internal morale and how your employees are thinking about you as a business and as a business operator, and whether in fact part of their time is now being spent dusting off their resume to look for another job. Financial risk ties into all of this because, as I mentioned before, there are regulatory fines, not to mention the fact that there can be civil litigation. And I realize that we are all sitting in the state of New Jersey, but if you were subject to the California Consumer Privacy Act, then you could in fact be subject to private causes of action if you failed to use reasonable measures to protect data, and then you had a breach that compromised information about consumers who are residents of the state of California. I will tell you right now, in New Jersey, there is not a law like that on the books. However, several legislators are trying to push forward statutes in New Jersey that would mirror, in many respects, the California legislation. So New Jersey right now, you're not going to face that type of financial burden, but don't assume it's not coming down the pike. And then, of course, there's a litigation, as I mentioned, whether it's private causes of action, whether it's answering to regulators or otherwise. And all of these things go back into reputation and financial impact and your internal morale and your operations. And it becomes a huge distraction if you are not prepared to respond in a timely manner to a breach. Again, if you're still wondering why you're doing this, as I mentioned, if your own website says we use reasonable measures to protect our information, and in fact you don't, that's an FTC violation. That's considered an unfair and deceptive trade practice. I go back to the Zoom settlement again. One of the things that Zoom said in its privacy policy that was outward facing to consumers was that it used 256 end-to-end bit encryption. In fact, they only used 128 encryption, which, by the way, is not considered best practices. So not only were they not doing exactly what they said on their privacy policy, but in fact, what they were doing was not considered adequate or reasonable. I have a laundry list of other regulations here, including HIPAA, which if any of you are in the healthcare industry, you recognize. And by the way, before we move off of HIPAA, I just want to share with you that just because you have protected health information, or I'm sorry, personal health information, PHI, doesn't mean that you're subject necessarily to HIPAA, unless you're a covered entity, that is a healthcare provider or a clearinghouse for healthcare claims, or if you're a business associate of a covered entity. So for example, if you were an accounting practice that was helping a healthcare provider managing their billing, then you might be subject to HIPAA. But just by the fact that you have medical records of personnel or medical information about personnel doesn't mean that you're subject to HIPAA. If you're in the financial industry, you might be dealing with Gramm-Leach-Bliley or the New York State cyber regulations, which apply to the financial and insurance industry. My guess is most of you are not dealing with the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was adopted in Europe back in 2018. But if in fact you are advertising overseas, then you may indeed be subject to GDPR and its requirements. I mentioned again the California Consumer Privacy Act. And a lot of you may be saying, I'm in New Jersey, I don't need to worry about CCPA. However, if you're a vendor to a larger business that is subject to the California Consumer Privacy Act, then your customers may be requiring you to adopt procedures that are consistent with CCPA because they're required to vet their vendors and to vet their vendors' security and data protection practices. The New York Shield Act is one which may in fact impact many of you on this webinar today, because if you have personal information with regard to residents of New York, and that may be your customers or it could be your employees, again, you now have an obligation affirmatively to take reasonable steps to protect that information. Now, I will tell you that the New York Shield Act looks at reasonableness in the eyes of the size of the business, the dollars and cents available to you to implement whatever might be those reasonable measures, and the number of records that you have. But in no event does the New York Shield Act take the position that you don't have to do anything. And unlike California's Consumer Privacy Act, which only applies to for-profit businesses, New York Shield Act doesn't make that distinction. So whether you're a for-profit entity or a not-for-profit entity, you are subject to New York Shield Act if you have information with regard to New York consumers. If you have cyber insurance, and some of you may not, and we'll discuss that later in this presentation, and you represented to your insurance carrier that you have certain measures in place and you've checked those boxes and said, yes, I have this, yes, I have that, yes, I've got this, and in fact, you don't, you've just given your insurance carrier a reason not to cover a claim that you might assert if, God forbid, you do have a data breach. And finally, by contract. My guess is that many of you, if you are vendors to third-party customers, have signed non-disclosure agreements. And a lot of folks are still in the mindset of the traditional non-disclosure, meaning that you won't leave physical papers around, that you won't share with somebody else confidential information, that you won't stand on a train platform, for those of us that still take trains these days in COVID, and talk about a new business or a new product. But non-disclosure agreements don't necessarily discriminate in terms of how data could be disclosed or compromised. So if you have a data breach and you've committed to your clients that you will keep their information confidential, you've just breached that undertaking. And depending upon how that contract is written, you may have unlimited liability. Because I will tell you right now, if I drafted that non-disclosure agreement, I typically will carve out from any caps on liability a breach of confidentiality. So if you do nothing else after this webinar is over, go back and take a look at the contracts that you have signed if you are in fact serving larger customers or smaller customers for that matter, where you have entered into a non-disclosure agreement or any other type of contract where you said you will assume liability in the event of a breach of confidential information. So what are we preparing for? I don't like to use the B word, breach. Instead, when a client contacts me and says, I've had a breach, I say, no, for the moment, as far as I know, you've had an incident. An incident is where somebody may have knocked on the proverbial door or even gotten into your systems, but it doesn't mean necessarily that data has been compromised. I will tell you in my office that we have encryption solutions so that even if a bad actor got into our systems, what they would be seeing was basically gobbledygook. Not a legal term, but it means that our data is encrypted using algorithms. And unless you have the decryption key, even though you got into my system, that's not a reportable breach of a compromise of personally identifiable information or protected health information. And that's a very important distinction. Encryption is your get out of jail for free card. Not all small businesses have adopted encryption solutions because they take the position of this is expensive. Again, there are different levels of encryption. 128-bit encryption, as I mentioned before, and Zoom was cited for it, is not considered best in breed. However, I go back to the barking dog example. If you can get 128-bit encryption for free versus no encryption, it's better than nothing. And if you use a cloud provider, if you're using, for example, Microsoft 360 or AWS, what have you, ask them what their encryption solutions are and what they would charge for those, because that may be the distinction for you between whether an event is an incident or a breach. I'll give you another example. Let's suppose that, God forbid, I were to lose my cell phone. My cell phone has access to my work environment on it. However, the data in my work environment is encrypted, and my firm has installed on my cell phone mobile device management software, so that if, God forbid, this got lost and I report that loss to my IT department, they can wipe the data remotely. And so long as the data was not accessed between the time that I lost my phone and when I reported it, that's not a reportable breach, whether it's under your contracts with your customers or under New Jersey State breach notification. A breach has not occurred. If, however, your systems are compromised and your data is not encrypted, now you have potentially a reportable breach, whether it's to your customers, whether it's to regulators, whether to the impacted individuals. So you need to know what has occurred and what you need to do about it, depending on what, in fact, the incident involves. In terms of costs, and I understand a lot of small businesses say to me whenever I have this presentation or I speak to them one-on-one, they say to me, Michelle, it's not in this year's budget. I can't afford the encryption. I can't afford the barking dog. I'm happy I can afford to attend this webinar, which, by the way, is for free. Except if you look at these figures, these are serious numbers. The cost of an average data breach last year was over $3 million. Now, if you're a small business coming to the SBDC, I know what your annual revenues don't exceed. Do you really want to lose close to $4 million because you couldn't afford that barking dog? And again, remember, any layer of preventive measures is making you that much less appealing than the neighboring business that didn't buy the dog, that didn't get the encryption solution, that didn't adopt some form of reasonable measure to prevent a breach or to minimize its impact. Keep in mind, this isn't going away. Breaches have increased, and the cost of those breaches have increased exponentially. And with COVID going on and people working remotely, the incidents and breaches have skyrocketed. So now more than ever, businesses need to be cognizant of this. You can't ignore this anymore. As far as who needs to be prepared, a breach is, or should I say, cybersecurity and cyber mindfulness is not just an IT issue. Everybody says to me, oh, I've got a guy. My guy's got it covered, whether the guy is a guy or a gal. Everybody's got their IT guy. The problem is that if the CEO doesn't care, guess what? Nobody else is going to care either. And again, if you look at some of the big cases, for example, Yahoo, Equifax, just to name a few, it's the CEO's heads that are in many cases rolling. And in fact, some breach laws now include not only civil penalties, but criminal exposure as well. And that's not for the IT guy. That's going to be for the CEO, or for that matter, for the in-house counsel. And if you've got a board of directors or a board of advisors to answer to, they may look to have you removed if you're not taking this seriously. There are a lot of folks at Yahoo that lost their jobs over those breaches because of how they failed to prepare and then how they responded. Again, you want to make sure that if you're adopting these measures, if you're implementing procedures, be transparent. Let your personnel know what you're doing. Let your customers know what you're doing. And when I say let them know what you're doing, I'm not telling you to share with them specifically what measures you've put in place, because that's confidential and proprietary to you. But think about what TD Bank did many years ago when they went green and they became more environmentally friendly. They turned that into a marketing opportunity. They were the green bank. They were the ones who had solar on their systems. They were looking for LEED certification, what have you. Think about how you could manage that message and say to both your personnel and your customers, we are being proactive. We care and we're doing something here. And if you lead by example as a business leader, your personnel are going to be that much more invested in the process. As far as what needs to be protected, you need to understand, first of all, what's required of you by law or your contract. So I mentioned before the New Jersey state breach notification laws. I mentioned California Consumer Privacy Act, which has a proactive component, the New York Shield Act, and I also mentioned HIPAA. So you need to think about what type of data you have and what your protection obligations are with regard to that data. And again, it's not just customer information, it's your personnel's information. And you also want to think about your proprietary trade secrets. So many people are focused on how they're going to be fined under the breach notification laws if personally identifiable information is compromised, but they forget about, for example, a new product. I mean, if you think about the Coca-Cola formula, that is one of the best kept trade secrets in the history of trade secrets. If God forbid that Coca-Cola formula got out, how much would Coca-Cola be worth tomorrow? You want to make sure that your secret sauce is being protected. And if you're holding information of your customers, that is their secret sauce, it needs to be protected. You also need to understand where your digital assets are, as well as your paper assets. So I mentioned before my handy dandy little cell phone. My cell phone is a personal device of mine that is managed by my office, but this contains valuable data. I'm working on a laptop that my company leases from a third party. That laptop contains sensitive information. You all are probably watching this on a tablet or what have you. Those devices are containing information. My office is filled with file cabinets filled with paper. Paper can be the subject of a data breach. In fact, one of our clients had a whole bunch of medical records. They had them in file boxes. The boxes were out in the hallways. They weren't in locked cabinets. They weren't locked in a storage room. And so if you think about it, anybody who was part of that company's cleaning vendor could have walked into the business in the evening when nobody else was around, taken out their handy dandy cell phone, open each box and take a picture of the document on top of each individual box. And they could have stolen in that one fell swoop the records of 5 patients, 10 patients, 20 patients, depends on how many boxes were in the hallway. And if they were really industrious and there weren't security cameras installed in this building, a cleaning vendor could have just picked one box and carried it out the door. And there would have gone hundreds of protected health information records from that one office. So you need to understand where information is. Something that you may have also heard about is data mapping. And again, when we think about our computer systems, you need to understand, where are those digital breadcrumbs? Are they staying only on a workstation? Are they on a laptop? Are they going into the cloud? Are they being stored in a vendor's environment? You need to know where that digital footprint is if you're going to protect assets. When we think about who you need to worry about and who's got your data and what they're doing with it, you may have heard expressions under certainly the General Data Protection Regulation, controller and processor. The controller under the General Data Protection Regulation is the one who says, I want this information, this is why I want this information, and this is what I and my processors are going to do with this information. If you're a processor, then you're the one who's being told, go collect this for me. You don't have to worry about why you're collecting it. That's my decision, but you're the one who's processing it. But processing is a very broad term when we think about data protection. And I share with you here the definition from the General Data Protection Regulation. But it's not, again, just a European issue. And I will tell you that in the US, there are statutes on the books, which a lot of people don't realize, in terms of data destruction. So that if you have records that contain personally identifiable information, protected health information or otherwise, you can't just take that information and throw it out. It has to be securely disposed of. And when I say securely disposed of, for my office, every single office has its own Shred-it box. And that's the brand, the company that we use. When Shred-it comes to pick up our sensitive papers that we want to have shredded, they bring their truck with the shredding machine into our driveway. They empty out the Shred-it boxes and they shred it right on site. So there is no risk in the data destruction process of that truck being hijacked and those documents being misappropriated. Now, you're probably thinking, well, I'm a small business owner. I can't afford that. Well, you can go pick up a small shredding machine over at Home Depot or Office Depot, or fill in the blank, Staples, and now you can securely destroy documents. Remember, though, that we're talking about a remote workforce right now. So to the extent that you have employees working at home and they're printing documents on personal devices, how are those documents being managed? How are those documents going to be securely stored? How are those documents going to be securely destroyed? These are things that you need to think about. But as soon as you start processing data, you should be thinking about what reasonable measures are you going to be implementing to protect that information through the life cycle of data. And when I say life cycle of data, it's from the day that you decide, I want to collect information, until the day that you have securely destroyed that piece of data, that you need to think about what measures are in place to protect that information. When we think about what happens if you don't do any of what we're talking about today, and I mentioned before the breach notification laws. One of our clients was located in one of those square states. And when you say one of the square states, okay, so we've all been thinking about the election and you've been looking at the electoral map. And in the Midwest, you've got states that have not only their own state, but they're surrounded by 5 or 4 other states rather. One of our clients had employees located in 5 different states, and they were subject to a breach that compromised their entire HR database. They had to comply with 5 different states' breach notification laws. That's, trust me, a real headache, particularly if you don't have an incident response plan, which we'll talk about later. You also have to consider the proactive legislations that's out there. So this slide mentions 25 states have some form of proactive legislation. I think that number may actually be up to 30 at this point. And I guess, as I mentioned, even if you're not subject to the California Consumer Privacy Act, if you're not subject to HIPAA, you may very well be subject to the New York Shield Act to the extent that you have employees or customers that are New York residents. Now, let's assume that you've listened to all of this and you've said, yeah, maybe I should listen to Michelle and I need to go out and get that equivalent of the barking dog, but you don't know where to start. Well, the good news is that there are a lot of resources out there, many of which, by the way, are free, right up there with SBDC and its offerings that you can take advantage of. NIST Framework is a terrific resource. Now, I will caution you that if you go on to NIST website, and NIST is a federal resource for a set of standards that you can work with and adapt to your business. The NIST frameworks comes in several different flavors and sizes. You don't want the 800-page NIST framework for a small business. Trust me, it'll drive you nuts. You'll go blind and you'll say, why did she send me to NIST? What you want to look for is the NIST resources for small and mid-sized businesses. It's a very digestible framework. It gives you some useful tips, tools, and controls. I mentioned here also CIS controls and resources. Again, if you go online and do an internet search for CIS controls, you will find some free resources. Another one that's not mentioned on this slide, and I would encourage you to write it down, is SANS, S-A-N-S. The SANS Institute has some wonderful checklists and forms that you can use that will help you to develop a framework and to help you develop written policies and procedures. I will caution you, though, that when you look at, for example, the SANS resources, one of the written policies that they have is, for example, for a clean desk policy. Now, I know you can see into my office where I'm sitting right now, and as you could gather, I'm not very good at throwing away paper. I do not have a clean desk. However, my office has risk mitigation strategies in place. So, for example, between the hours of 8 a.m. and 7 p.m., 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., you can get into my office, but you can't get upstairs to where my desk is without coming up the elevator bank, checking in with reception, getting a visitor's badge, and so on and so forth. After 7 o'clock and before 8 a.m., you can't even get into our building unless you have a pass that gives you access to our building. We also have security cameras located throughout our office. So if somebody came into my office and tried to steal the paper that's on my desk, that would be captured by our security cameras. So keep in mind that if you adopt a policy and you only follow it in the exception, that's almost as bad as having no policy. So when you look at these different frameworks and want to adopt one or another, make sure that number one, you're not just taking the form and filling in your name here. And number two, that you're not adopting policies that are not going to be followed. And let me just go back to my reference to the forms for a minute, and I'll share with you recently one of my clients that engaged me to help them with their privacy policies and data security practices, what have you. And when I was having the introductory call with the client, I went online and just looked at their website to see what they had posted there. And I had to laugh because at one point in the website, there was in the privacy policy a bracketed statement that says, insert company name here. They hadn't bothered to take that out and insert the company name. So number one, I knew that they had cut and pasted this from a different resource. And number two, that they certainly didn't take into consideration whether the statements in the privacy policy accurately reflected what they were indeed doing. Remember what I told you about Zoom. So don't just copy forms and frameworks and say, oh yeah, this is what I'm doing. But these are resources that will help you understand how to get started. In terms of what to do, and I've alluded to this at various times in our discussion already, you want to first identify what your assets are. Then you want to assess the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in your systems and in your policies to understand what you need to mitigate and remediate. Once you've then developed a data map, you know where your data assets are, you've tried as best you can to mitigate or remediate potential vulnerabilities, then you want to monitor your systems so that if, God forbid, and when, it's not an if, the breach or incident happens, you detect it quickly. You're not waiting for 9 years to figure out that you've been compromised. And then you want to respond, you want to contain the breach, you want to eradicate the breach, and recover and get back to business as usual. And that's the most important thing for small business owners. The longer it takes for you to recover, the less likely you're going to be in business the following year after a data breach. And that's a very scary proposition for a small business owner. In understanding what the vulnerabilities are, and again, we already talked about this, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but you're talking about loss of time, loss of information, the loss of money, the loss of credibility, and the loss of identity. If you've compromised or allowed to be compromised the identity of your consumers, of your personnel, all of that has been impacted. And you need to understand where are your systems and where is your data exposed. So for example, do you have open external ports? Back in the 90s, and I am that old that I've been writing contracts that long, we used to write software licensing agreements that you wanted the software vendor to have an open port into your systems. And you say, well, why would you want that? Well, the idea was that if, God forbid, a mission critical system went down, you wanted the vendor to be able to remote in and fix the system quickly for you so that you didn't have downtime. The problem is that many of those older access points were never disabled. And if you're running old software on your systems, They may be unpatched. Remember, Windows 7 is no longer supported by Microsoft. And if you're using an unsupported software, whether it's an old version of Windows or any other software solution that is no longer supported by the software vendor, there are probably known vulnerabilities out there that bad actors can and will exploit. When you think about USB drive accessibility, on our workstations in our office, you cannot put in a USB drive. Instead, you have to go to our IT department. They will take the USB drive and put it onto a standalone computer to make sure that there's nothing lurking on that USB drive that shouldn't be there. When you say, well, what are you talking about? What could be lurking on there? I will share with you one of my most famous or infamous war stories when it comes to a USB drive. And I believe this was back in 2013 when the ADA had its convention. All the dentists got together. They were hearing about the latest procedures for teeth whitening and torturing patients and all those fun things. And one of the presentations mentioned, oh, by the way, the codes for insurance claims have changed. And so everybody in the audience groaned and said, oh, God, now we have to change all our billing processes and our coding procedures and what have you. So instead of a root canal being 1, 2, 3, now it's 5, 7, 8, or whatever the new codes would be. And the ADA said, don't worry. In your convention packets is a USB drive with all the new codes. So when you get back to your offices, all you need to do is plug this USB drive into your computer and you're good to go. From the ADA, this is from a trusted source. So of course, all the little dentists go back to their offices, and a couple of dentists didn't waste any time and popped the USB drive into their computers and loaded up the file and loaded with it malware. The USB drives had been purchased by the ADA from a source in China, and they came pre-loaded with malware. And the ADA didn't bother to check whether the USB drives were clean or not. So be mindful that things happen even when you're dealing with trusted sources. I understand that you guys are small businesses. Rome wasn't built in a day, and cyber risk management and cyber programs and policies are not going to come into play in a full-blown, fully developed program tomorrow. But you've got to start somewhere. And one of the things that you'll hear about is this notion of a risk assessment. Risk assessments come in different flavors. So by way of example, one of our clients is a water purveyor, fancy name for somebody who provides water to your community. And back in 2017, the laws changed, which required water purveyors to have cybersecurity programs in place. So I went down there to do the informal risk assessment for this particular I'm sorry, not informal, non-technical risk assessment for this water purveyor. So by way of example, I went down there and interviewed the whole company in terms of how do they process credit card payments? How do they receive credit card payments? How do they handle payments by checks? How do they handle people coming in and out of the offices? How do they protect records? How do they protect the water supply? Do they have security cameras? Are those security cameras connected to the internet? Are all of them functioning? How high is the security fence? And does it have barbed wire at the top? All of these things went into the risk assessment on the non-technical side that I went through with the client. Additionally, my recommendation was that they bring in an outside vendor to do a technological risk assessment. Are there in fact open ports in their system so that the software vendor could come in unannounced and make changes to systems? Are you using encryption solutions and so on and so forth? These are the different things that would be identified in a risk assessment. And then you would get back a report from the third party that did this assessment that said, okay, you've got this many high risks, this many medium risks, and this many low risks. As a small business owner, you don't have to correct everything at once. And in fact, if God forbid there were a compromise, what you would want to be able to say to regulators is, I have a plan. I did the risk assessment. I saw my high, medium, and low risks. I've prioritized and I've budgeted how I'm going to address each one of them and when, and here's my plan. What you don't want to say to regulators, if the God forbid happens, is, oh, my plan's somewhere, or yeah, it's in my head. You need to be able to document what you've done. You want to show how you're moving forward. In terms of risk response, and again, that's what we're talking about here, is threats and vulnerabilities and the associated risk and what you do with that information. So one of the responses to risk is avoidance. You say, well, what do you mean avoidance? So one of my clients was a provider of services to the to the pharmaceutical industry. One of the contracts that they asked me to review for them was with a major pharmaceutical firm. And the contract included 3 pages dedicated only to cybersecurity, data privacy, and the liability to my client if any of their systems were compromised that contained personally identifiable information, protected health information, or any other data belonging to the company. And the contract also did not limit the liability that our client would be exposed to in the event of a breach of those 3 pages of cybersecurity and data protection. And I said to my client, are they paying you enough for you to assume that risk? And if the answer was no, don't sign the contract. You could avoid that risk by not engaging in that activity or not entering into that agreement. You could mitigate the risk. Now, this doesn't mean that you're eliminating it, but you're reducing it. So again, I mentioned before that you can't get into my office physically after hours without having a fob. Now, does that mean that somebody who thinks they're being helpful aren't going to hold the door for somebody? It's human nature. We try to be helpful. So have I completely eliminated the risk of somebody getting into my office after hours? No. Have I reduced it? Yes. In terms of remediation or elimination, if I've now destroyed data that I no longer need, I've eliminated the risk associated with that data. So for example, if I had customers that used to come by my business or were clients of mine 10 years ago, but they haven't picked up the phone and they haven't called me in 10 years, why do I still have information about them on my systems? There's no reason to. And I will tell you, by law, not cybersecurity laws, but laws with regard to employers, you need to keep data with regard to former employees for a long time. However, you don't need to keep that data online. Eliminate the risk of that data being available through the internet and keep it offline. Put it on a floppy disk, if anybody remembers what those are. Put it on a USB drive so that it's not actively available online, and put those storage devices into a safe. If you ever need the data, you could call it up, but you've eliminated the risk, you've remediated the risk of that being accessible by a breach to your systems. You could also shift risk. For example, engaging with a cloud provider or hiring a vendor to do certain tasks for you. It doesn't eliminate the risk. And you want to make sure that if you are shifting risk, that you're making sure your contracts also shift and push downstream liability wherever you can. Or you could make an educated decision. And I go back to my client who was engaging with this pharmaceutical firm and say, yeah, they are paying me enough money for me to assume that risk, and I'll take that on. Those are choices that you make as a business owner. In terms of mitigation and what business owners can do, and again, I understand that there may not be so much in your budget to do everything at once, but these are basic things that you should be thinking about. Antivirus software. Come on, guys. If you don't have antivirus software installed in your systems, you can download some of this stuff for free or for literally pennies a month. Install it now. Firewalls should be appropriately put into place and appropriately configured. So make sure that your IT guy or gal, if you're putting in a firewall, has configured it appropriately for your systems. Passwords, change it like your underwear, not daily necessarily. And the more robust that your passwords are, then you don't necessarily have to change them, for example, quarterly. Now, I will tell you right now that if your password policy for your employees is only 6 digits, 6 characters, that ain't gonna cut it. However, if you require employees or personnel to have 14 digits and characters and what have you, then you probably don't have to change passwords more frequently than once every 6 months, so long as the password isn't "I love pizza." So Think about that and be smart. Think about security questions and security answers. So for example, when you're opening up an account, the security question that you select shouldn't be something that I can find out online about you, like where you went to elementary school. You want to make sure that if you're using security questions, don't make the answers obvious. Don't make the answer something that somebody can find out about you online. Multi-factor authentication is something that if you don't have in place for your devices, for your systems, for your accounts, I encourage you to do it. Some solutions are more expensive than others, but again, to the extent that you're using third-party resources, ask the question. If I've got a cloud account, if I've got a Facebook account, if I've got a Gmail account, any account that you've got out there, ask what's available. And again, ask what encryption solutions are available. When you receive a notice on your cell phone or on your device or anything else that an update's available, how many of you say, oh, I don't have time to wait for my computer or my device to update, and you hit remind me later? Well, guess what? Upgrades, more often than not, are a euphemism for patches. And patches close up known vulnerabilities. And I will tell you right now, Microsoft does Patch Tuesday. Every Tuesday, Microsoft releases patches for known vulnerabilities in their systems. They'll come out with an alert that might be not on a Tuesday if there's a high level risk. But when you receive notice that a patch for an upgrade is available, don't wait. Make sure it's a legitimate patch from the appropriate source and then install it. Now, I will tell you, for small business owners, patching your entire environment is not that daunting a task. If you have a much larger footprint, then you may have challenges. And in fact, if you remember the NotPetya attack several years ago that took down systems and businesses across the world, literally, one of the businesses that was compromised was a multinational law firm. The US footprint and the US data practices of that particular law firm were quite robust. However, the business was in expansion mode, and they had just merged, or should I say, acquired a firm in the Ukraine. The firm in Ukraine's systems were not up to snuff, but the business was too rushed. They needed that firm brought into the fold. And so they connected the systems from the Ukraine to the rest of the firm's legal network, and the systems in the Ukraine weren't patched. That's how that firm got hit by NotPetya. So you want to make sure that you're applying those patches as soon as they're available, and making sure, to the extent that you have employees that are working remotely, that they're patching their personal devices and systems. Antivirus software is not going to be the be all that end all. Antivirus software will prevent known viruses out there. But if it's a new exploit, if it's a day zero attack, that's not going to protect you. However, there's a lot out there that it will protect. So don't skimp on the antivirus software, but just understand that it's not the be all that end all. So again, I refer you to putting into place firewalls or other intrusion detection and prevention systems. Some are more expensive than others, but at least look into it. Consider putting in the budget for the following year. There are other things that you can do, and that is making sure that computers and devices will time out for inactivity. If I step away and I'm thinking, oh, I'm just going to the restroom, and then I get distracted and somebody talks to me over by the water cooler, and then I decide to go get another cup of coffee or what have you, I don't come back to my desk for another 30 minutes, my computer should time out. There's no reason that somebody should be able to walk into my office and see what's on my screen if I'm not sitting here actively working for an extended period of time. I mentioned data destruction, making sure that you're appropriately shredding paper documents, that you're appropriately removing documents from your system. As a computer expert will tell you, delete doesn't necessarily mean delete. So if you've got information on devices, before you donate those devices to charity, make sure that information has been removed. I will tell you that one of the things that freaks out a lot of people when I'm doing these presentations is thinking about your car. A lot of people lease vehicles these days. A lot of people tie their cell phones to their car so that they can use Bluetooth. When I got my last leased car, or actually I take that back, my last used car or pre-owned car, I went to sync up my phone with the Bluetooth device in the car, and it called up a phone book with all these points of contact. And I said, who are these people? This isn't my point of contact. The prior owner of the car hadn't wiped their phone book from the car, and the dealership hadn't bothered to wipe it. So these are things that you need to think about. I mean, you think about when you go to ShopRite and there's that bin to say, donate your device here. If you haven't wiped your data from that device, that's a problem. And I don't know if you saw recently, but ShopRite was just cited because when you went to check out from picking up prescriptions at ShopRite, what was happening at some of their locations when they replaced the checkout devices where you put in your credit card and what have you, rather than securely destroying those devices, they threw them into a dumpster. So anybody could have gone literally dumpster diving, taken those devices, and downloaded the credit card data from that information. Make sure that you are remediating what you can. Even if it's not everything on this list, something's better than nothing. Getting the barking dog makes you less of an attractive target than the adjacent business. One of the best things that you can do is pick up the phone. If you get an email from somebody that you weren't expecting, if you get a notice that somebody has changed their banking information, don't necessarily believe it's true. It could in fact be that you were receiving a spoofed email, a scam email. And if you pick up the phone and verify, think about the hurt that you could save yourself and the third party. There's a law firm in the state of New Jersey that I do business with. I know a number of the attorneys at the firm, but I don't know everybody. And last year I got an email from a partner that said, here's this proposal, please contact me after you've reviewed it. Well, given what I do professionally and I'm paid to be paranoid, I'm thinking, I don't know this guy. I wasn't expecting a proposal. So I went onto the internet. I looked up the known email address for the attorney who supposedly sent this to me, and I sent him an email. And I said, did you send me a proposal? And I went one step further. I called his known phone number, called him and said, hey, Joe, you and I haven't worked together before. Did you send me a proposal? Please give me a call back. And I left him my phone number. Before he called me back, I got an email back to my email that said, yes, I sent you this proposal. I look forward to hearing from you. But again, remember, I'm paid to be paranoid. So I waited. Well, I waited, and sure enough, I got a phone call from Joe 2 hours later that said, thank you so much for calling me. It turns out the law firm had been breached. They didn't know it. The bad actors had gotten into their systems, and they had set up a rule which allowed a bad actor to redirect their emails and answer an email like mine, which went to the known email address. So if you do nothing else after this, along with checking your contracts, remember, if you get something you're not expecting, pick up the phone, call somebody, reach out to them at their known location, at their legitimate site, and not what's in the suspect email that you just received. Pinky swearing is not going to cut the mustard. And when you think about your workforces, now granted, a lot of you may have actually been working remotely all along, but some of your business and some of your employees aren't used to working remotely. They don't have appropriate measures in place, and they may not be working remotely alone. They may have somebody who's listening in on conversations. They may be distracted because their kids are also learning online in the same place where they're doing their work. And the scary thought is that your employees, whether they're malicious or whether they're just negligent, account for 60% of data breaches. So think about that. With a remotely working workforce, you could prevent 60% of breaches if you addressed potential exposure just with your personnel. Personnel may not be trained. They may be using routers that have default passwords. They may be using insecure mobile devices. I will tell you, one of my clients, a small CPA firm, 4 full-time employees, 4 seasonal employees, had an employee who was working on a computer that his son also used to game. In November, the year before the client contacted me, their remote employee was working at home and a bad guy got into his computer. Didn't know it. It was through one of his son's gaming sites. Fast forward to February, and my client's working late at night online, working on one of his customers' returns, and all of a sudden the return e-files. He didn't hit file, it just went. He scratched his head and said, that's weird. Why did it do that? Didn't think anything about it. Spoke to his guy the next day. He said, oh, it's probably just you may have hit a button. You didn't realize it was 11 o'clock at night. Don't worry about it. It happens again 2 weeks later. And now he calls up his IT guy and says, yeah, there's something hinky going on here. So the IT guy calls the software vendor. And the software vendor says, there must have been something funny going on. Don't worry about it. You may need to do a paper file for that particular customer. Don't worry about it. Well, the third time it happened, the CPA had the sense to pick up the phone and contact me. When we finished our forensic investigation, we discovered that when the bad guys had gotten in back in November, they shared that information with their friends. And that's what bad actors do. They'll go on to the dark web and they'll say, hey, did you see this web? It's open. This CPA firm has an open port and you can get in there because they haven't patched their vulnerabilities. Come right in. And when we looked at the forensics, it showed that dwell time in their system went from 2 minutes to 4 hours in some cases. And the locations of the bad actors were Florida, Texas, the Ukraine, North Korea, Russia, fill in the blank. Everybody was having a field day in this poor little CPA's business systems because they weren't secure and nobody was aware of what was going on. And nobody bothered to tell the remotely working employee, you shouldn't have your kid gaming on the same computer that you're working on tax returns. The other thing that's very scary these days is because we're all working remotely, it might not seem odd that you get an email from mshap@gmail.com as opposed to mshap@csglaw.com. It may in fact not be for me, but you need to be asking the questions. And same thing with phone numbers, because people are working remotely. You may have a phone number come up that's not what you're used to seeing for a particular client or a particular employee, but it's out there. One of the things that you may have heard of is vishing. Vishing is when you get a phone scam. These things are happening all the time. And in fact, today, one of our employees reached out to me this morning to tell me that they had gotten a call from the Social Security Administration that they had a problem with their account and they needed to call this number immediately. Well, the good news is that my personnel are trained, and she reached out to me, including sending to me the phone number that was left on her message that she needed to call. I forwarded that to the state police, and I will tell you right now that my contact at the state police cyber unit had a really good time on the phone with the bad actors, and in fact kept them on the phone for a good 15 minutes to really get the lay of the land as to what they were doing here. I will tell you what's very disturbing is how COVID has amplified vishing attacks. And this was back in March and April when cases were really horrific, although sadly in our state, as you know, they are going up. What was happening was that people were getting calls. Hi, this is so-and-so at the hospital. Your loved one needs to be put on a respirator, but the insurance coverage has lapsed. If you give me the credit card number right now, I'll get in touch with the insurance company, get the insurance back in place, and your loved one will be put on a ventilator immediately. That sounds crazy, but there were enough people who had loved ones in the hospital who they couldn't see, who they couldn't communicate. And that urgency, that, oh my God, people were responding to. It's these types of compromises that are happening that people need to be aware of. You need to train your personnel. You need to look out because these things are on the rise. It is nonstop, and people are looking to exploit the fact that we are isolated. We're working at home. We don't have the smell test of coworkers. Another one of the scams that's going around is the termination notice. And sadly, in this day and age of COVID, a lot of businesses are laying off people. But if you weren't laying off your workforce, you might be getting a layoff notice. You may be getting training offers saying, we'll help you to train for your next job, thinking that you're being helped, and you click on it because sadly you're desperate, you need income. But in fact, it's a scam. Job offers are now scams where they're looking to entice people to apply for jobs. And I will tell you, these scams look very real. They're very sophisticated, and they ask you to complete a typing test. They ask you to complete a skills test and what have you. And then to complete your onboarding process, you have to enter your social security number. And suddenly the job never materializes. You never get a paycheck, but now all of your accounts have been compromised. And that's what's happening right now, which is beyond disturbing. Another type of scam that's going around are PPP scams, SBA scams. You need to be very mindful of what you're getting. If you're not sure, pick up the phone, ask questions of known resources. Don't just give away your personal data. Don't just give away your account information. It's very easy if people are working on cell phones to misread things. And I give you several examples just using my own name. Because of the fact that I have two L's in my name, it's very easy to play with them. One of them could be a capital L and one could be, or rather a lowercase l, and one could be an uppercase I. And if you're looking at your cell phone while you're driving Junior to some event and you're reading it on here, you may think it's from Michelle at CSG Law. And in fact, it's from Michel capital IS, not from me, but you click on it anyway. You need to be very cognizant of what you're clicking on. And I realize I'm belaboring the point of the scams out there, but this is what you need to be aware of. And if you want to share some of these sample slides with your personnel so that they know what to look for, please do. Educate your personnel. Let them know what the scams look like. Here's yet another example. And if you look here, what's very helpful is that if you hover your mouse over the HTTPS Wells Fargo supposed link, what you got was, what the link really was gotcha.com. Hover your mouse over links when you get suspect emails. But again, remember I told you the example of the law firms whose emails were being routed? So even if you did that in the case of that particular law firm compromise, it would still come up as a legitimate link. And that's why you need to pick up the phone. This email came into our office the other day, supposedly alerting us to a payment by one of our clients. It appeared to be from the email of, in fact, somebody who I deal with at the business. But again, given what I do, I said, why am I getting notice about a payment from this particular client? This just strikes me as odd. Now, I didn't have available to me a way to securely send that to my IT department to take a look at. So what I did was I used my cell phone. I took a picture of the email and I forwarded it to my IT department. The reason why I did it that way is I didn't want to click on the link. And I didn't want to forward the active email with the active link in it. So that if God forbid it got to somebody who wasn't paying attention and they clicked on the link. Once I alerted my IT department to it, then they could go in and isolate the email in my system. And sure enough, it turns out this was a phishing email with a suspect link. You want to make sure your people are trained. It's that simple. When you think about risk shifting, and I mentioned before going to the cloud, cloud is not a dirty word. It can be a terrific resource. And I'll tell you right now, the folks at AWS and Microsoft probably have much more resources or more resources available to them to give you a robust, secure platform than you could do on your own. However, you need to ask questions. You need to understand how your data is being secured. Is it going to be encrypted? Is it going to be encrypted when it travels from your system to the cloud environment? How do you get your data back when the relationship is ending? So you want to ask all of these questions. You can't just go to a third-party provider and not ask these questions. It's your responsibility to vet your vendors. A lot of you may use Square. And I'll tell you right now, if you look at the Square contracts, and I have looked at them, and there's a lot of fine print there, Square does not assume liability. However, I will tell you that Square does present itself as being PCI, payment card industry compliant, meaning that they have robust security practices in place. And they also do annual SOC 2s. They're ISO certified. And you want to ask those questions. If you're going to share your data with third parties, if you're going to entrust data with third parties, ask these questions. How are you protecting your information? What frameworks do you use? And by the way, if that third party vendor says to you, what's a framework? Run screaming. Go find a different vendor. Do not use Joe Blow on the highway. Make sure you're entrusting your data to appropriate third party providers when you're shifting that risk. In terms of insurance, insurance policies can provide some protections, but you need to understand what they cover and what they will not cover. And remember, I mentioned before about providing misinformation on your insurance application. If you give misinformation to your carrier and then you have a data breach, they're going to find a reason to deny your claim. You need to understand what the sublimits are in your insurance policy. You need to understand what time deductibles may be built into the policy. So when you think about your auto insurance, there are deductibles up to, say, $5,000 on your collision policy or what have you. With insurance policies, not only do you have a dollars and cents deductible, but you would also have for cyber insurance a time deductible. So it might say that they don't cover the first 8 hours of a data breach. Well, in the first 8 hours, that's when a lot of the world of hurt can happen. So you really want to understand what's being covered and what's not. And if your insurance agent says, oh yeah, you're covered, and they kind of brush off the conversation, find an agent who really understands what that fine print says and can explain it to you in English. And I go back to my poor CPA who had the compromise. He thought he had cyber insurance. What he had was a $50,000 policy that was slapped onto his professional liability policy with a $25,000 deductible. That was nothing when you look at what he spent to recover from that one breach. You want to understand whether it's going to cover the cost of somebody like me, the cost to provide notice to the people who have been compromised, and is it going to cover your liability if credit cards were compromised? These are questions you want to ask of your insurance agent. If they don't know the answer, find another agent. Again, as I said, understand what's not covered. I mentioned before your reputation. You're not going to get that back readily. Your insurance carrier is not going to cover you for loss of trust. However, it may cover you for the cost of a crisis communication firm, a PR firm that will help you to spin the message better. So understand what is and what is not covered. I'm not going to belabor the point on cyber insurance because I know that we're running close on time, and to the extent that anybody has questions, I want to have an opportunity to address those questions. So I'm going to move forward past my insurance section on slides. Feel free to look at these. If you have questions, reach out to me through the SBDC. So just bear with me as I move forward through these slides a little bit. So again, more on our cyber insurance. Back to monitoring. If you have a third party monitoring your systems, you want to make sure that you've got logs and that those logs are complete. Now, you as a business owner may have no idea what you're looking at when it comes to logs. However, I can tell you right now, one of my clients did have a breach last year. They had a third party monitoring their systems. And when the breach occurred, they brought in a different company to undertake forensics. The breach response company said, well, let's see your logs. They contacted the monitoring company, and lo and behold, there were gaps in the log. There was not an adequate audit trail to determine what may or may not have been compromised. So if you're going to put in a monitoring solution in place and you're going to have a third-party company looking at those logs for you, make sure that they're complete. Make sure that somebody is responding to them and giving you alerts, and then you're responding to those alerts. I go back to the Target breach. Target had put in all sorts of wonderful bells and whistles to monitor its systems when it had the compromise. The problem is nobody was reading the alerts. And so people at corporate were getting notices that there was something going on in the systems, but nobody was paying attention. As far as vendors are concerned, and again, I go back to the Target breach. I don't know if you guys realize, but the way that the Target compromise happened was because an HVAC vendor was compromised. So the HVAC vendor, similar to my CPA with his offsite, sometimes employee, had insecure systems. Bad guys got into the HVAC vendor's computer, which was connected remotely through an open port to Target systems. So you need to ask those questions I mentioned before. Do you have PCI compliance certification if you're entrusting a vendor with credit card processing? Is your environment encrypted if it's a cloud provider? Ask the questions, ask them what they've done proactively. Back up your data. Back it up regularly. One of my clients had a breach recently, and they had backups as recently as a week ago. Now you think about that and you say, oh God, a week's worth of business, that's awful. Well, that's better than having no backups. And you want to make sure that your backups are good. And when I say good, meaning that they're not compromised, that they're not infected by whatever may have hit your systems. And you want to make sure that you have clean servers and clean devices onto which you can bring that clean data back onto. And if you're using a cloud provider, ask them, if you guys were compromised, how quickly will you be back up and running? You want to know that if you've entrusted your information to a third party, they're going to back up your data and they can get back in action quickly. You need to have a plan. You can't call the Ghostbusters and you can't decide on the day that a breach happens, oh, I guess I should do something about this. Now, I want to reach into my bag for a minute, and I apologize for not having this out before we got started, but I want to share with you something. Now, I know you can't read the fine print on this right now, but this handy dandy little 4x6 index card has on it the following categories: lost or stolen device, cyber incident, suspected breach, suspected phish, misappropriation of access credentials, meaning your password was stolen, contact from client or law enforcement that we've had a data breach, meaning somebody's picked up the phone and said, did you know that you were breached? Office file compromise, something's been lost, something's been stolen. And on this same card is information, who to contact the firm, the office phone number, an alternate phone number, work email address, and alternate email address. This card is distributed to every single person in my office, so they know who to call if something happens. This is part of an incident response plan. Now, you also want to have resources available. Who are you going to call? Why are you going to call them? How are you going to interact with law enforcement? How are you going to interact with the media? Yeah, all of these things should be part of an incident response plan. And by the way, the NIST framework, as well as various other free resources that I've alluded to, and you'll see more at the end of this presentation, they provide to you templates for incident response plans to help you to start crafting this. Think about who should be on the incident response team. Again, it's not just an IT issue. It's got to be somebody from the C-suite. It should be your IT guy. It should be your HR folks. It should be your attorney. All of the resources that are going to come to bear, help you respond in a timely manner, help you detect, contain, eradicate, and recover, should be part of that incident response team. The plan should be where you're going to be able to find it. Think about your AEDs, and hopefully all of you have AEDs at your physical offices. You know where it is. It's either kept at reception, it's kept in the copy room, what have you. Your incident response plan should not be kept on the computer. It should be kept, well, it could be kept on the computer, except for the fact that if your computer's been compromised, how are you going to get it? So you should have paper. You should have it in binders. You should have it at your home. I sound like green eggs and ham. You should have it in a boat. You should have it in your car. You should have it in your home. Have it where people who are part of the incident response team are going to be able to access it, because the problem is that breaches don't happen conveniently. They happen on Friday, on the eve of a long weekend. They happen on New Year's Eve. They happen at 4:45 before 4th of July. You need to be prepared to respond quickly. Your programs should be repeatable, and adaptable. Your business isn't stagnant, and you don't want your incident response plan to be stagnant either. And as your business grows and as your attack surface grows, more people means more attack surface. You need to expand and repeat. One other thing I want to share with you is the FBI kill chain. So let's suppose that you get a phishing email or a spoofed email that says, "Hi, I'm your vendor and I've changed my banking relationship. So please, when you pay our next invoice, send it to ABC account instead of 123 account." You haven't picked up the phone, you don't verify it, and you send the wire to the new information. Your vendor calls you the next day and says, "Why didn't you pay this invoice?" And you have that lovely moment. If you contact the FBI within 48 to 72 hours, they may be able to recover all or a portion of those funds. But I will tell you, you need to contact them immediately. And although you can report this online, I will tell you that you'll be better served if you pick up the phone and get a human being and report it. Contact the FBI, contact your bank. Don't wait, or that money will be gone and you're not going to be able to recover it. And it may or may not be covered by your cyber insurance or your crime coverage. In terms of resources that I've been alluding to, you've got the FBI's resource, which is IC3. You've got NIST. You've got ISO. I mentioned also SANS. I mentioned various other resources for you. And certainly feel free to reach out to me. There are also public-private partnerships. NJ Kick is a wonderful resource. If you haven't already registered for the Kick, go online, Google Kick, sign up. It will give you weekly alerts of the latest and greatest in the state of New Jersey as to what's going on in the cyber community and what's the latest and greatest potential threat to your business. What you want to do is make sure that you're the house with the barking dog. One step will help you be that much less appealing to bad actors than the next business adjacent to you. Now, one thing I realized as I'm going through my slide deck here is that I pulled up an earlier slide deck. And when I say an earlier slide deck, I did this presentation back in March. So when you see the slide deck that Priscilla is going to share with you, there are going to be some other slides that we haven't discussed today. Most important for you guys when you look at that new slide deck is that it has some additional examples of what you can share with your personnel. It gives you some additional examples of the latest and greatest scams that are out there. So please take a look at that slide deck. The substance is similar to what we've discussed today, but what you're going to see are additional slides of scams that have just cropped up during COVID. Please share that with your personnel, share it with your family, educate people so that you, your business, your friends, your employees can be better secured. You want to be prepared. You want to identify, manage, detect, respond, recover, and repeat so that you're still in business after the proverbial hits the fan. Remember, it's not if, it's when. Priscilla, I've been doing an awful lot of talking. Do we have questions from our group? Priscilla?
Yes, Michelle, I'm here. I'm sorry. I don't see we have any question. Well, we have two questions here. How do you defend against zero-day attacks? Leo asked that question.
So in terms of how do you defend against a zero-day attack, the best way to defend against that is to have defenses in place. I mentioned encryption. So if you get hit by a new virus, a new type of malware, what have you, and your data is encrypted, even if a bad actor has gotten into your systems, all they're going to get is that technical word gobbledygook that I mentioned earlier. The other thing you want to make sure is that you've got backups or you've got alternatives. So in fact, I just recently did a tabletop exercise and the simulated event impacted an airline. And the airline couldn't run its reservation system because of the attack. So the question is, what did they have in place to resume operations immediately for the traveling public? Now, granted, it was slower, but they had a means to print manually boarding passes. And those are the types of things that you want to think about when you think about a zero-day attack. It may be something that somebody hasn't seen before, but if you've prepared and you've got alternative means to continue critical operations, that will reduce the impact of a zero-day attack. And again, if you have means to detect and report, the sooner you can detect, report, and contain, the better off you're going to be and mitigate the impact of that zero-day attack. Priscilla, you mentioned there was one other question.
Great. Well, the other question is not so much geared to you. They just, I think it's Leotrim. I'm hoping I pronounce your name. She just asked if she'll be receiving the slides or materials in the email. And the answer to that is yes. I did say that at the beginning, that a copy of the slides from today's presentation, along with a video replay, will be sent out within 48 to 72 hours, hopefully a lot sooner. But yes, everyone will receive a copy of the slides and the video replay of today.
And again, remember, as I mentioned, the slide deck that you'll be receiving from Priscilla is a little bit different than what we talked about today. It'll have some additional examples of the types of attacks that are out there now, just to help you again to be more aware and more prepared.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, so Leo asked, what kind of encryption do you recommend? I think this is a follow-up to the last question.
So in terms of encryption, I mentioned earlier in our conversation that not all encryptions are created equal. And Zoom got tagged because they advertised that they use 256-bit encryption, and in fact, they were only using 128. But again, 128, cheaper, not as good as 256, but better than nothing. So if I had my druthers, you'd have 256-bit encryption, and you'd have your data encrypted at rest as well as in motion. And making sure if you had data with third-party vendors, it was encrypted there as well. But something's better than nothing.
I think what it comes down to what you're attempting to guarantee. In the case of Zoom, they were saying 256 when they were only given 128.
And in addition to that, not just what you're representing that you have, but understanding what would or would not constitute a breach, at least with regard to personally identifiable information or protected health information. And that if that data is encrypted, even if a bad guy gets into your system, that is an incident, but it's not a reportable breach because the data was encrypted and the decryption key, hopefully, wasn't compromised.
Good. Okay. Do we have any additional questions? We have about a minute or so before we close out today's presentation, so please use the opportunity to post. So for everyone that's on today's presentation or on today's webinar, you do get the opportunity to have a one-on-one with Michelle. So we just need for you to acknowledge that you need that one-on-one, and we'll schedule that for you. We do understand that we have some people sometimes that are outside of the United States. Unfortunately, we are restricted to New Jersey. And if you are outside of New Jersey, we definitely can point you into the direction of your local SBDC. But if you are interested, if you're on today's webinar and you're from New Jersey, please, you can leave it in the chat, let us know, or you can send us an email that you would like to follow up one-on-one with Michelle in regards to today's presentation. So, so just last call for questions, and if not, we'll close out today's webinar. All right, Jen, great. We'll schedule that one-on-one for you and Michelle, no problem. You're welcome. Okay, last call. Any more questions? All right. Well, I would like to say thank you to Michelle for taking time out of her busy day to present us with this webinar, cybersecurity. As much as we did talk about it early enough, we do get people that are interested in the topic, but sometimes they don't follow through. And maybe, as we said in the beginning, it's because maybe we feel like it can't happen to us in small businesses. So I do urge you to take advantage of the one-on-one and precaution is better than the cure. So it's better for us to try something preemptive and make sure that we are up to date with in terms of security and a lot of the other things that Michelle mentioned in her presentation. So please feel free to reach out to us. Our information or email address is on the screen. And I think that telephone number should be 973-353-5950.
We'll have to
My
correct that.
apologies, yes, for that. But yes, feel free to reach out to us by email, or you can visit on our website at www.rnsbdc.com. At the end of this, at the close of this presentation, you will receive a pop-up for an evaluation. We do ask that you please take 1 or 2 minutes of your time to answer some questions and let us know if you enjoyed or found this presentation to be beneficial to you. We're in the planning stages right now for our 2021 calendar, and we're trying to decide which programs to keep and which new ones to offer for the upcoming year. So your input is greatly appreciated. Your feedback on our programs are appreciated. So please take some time to do that. So if there's no further, I saw one pop here. Leo, I don't know what you're saying here, but we're closing. So I would just say, send us an email. You can follow up with Michelle with a one-on-one and she can answer any additional questions that you may have. So thank you for taking the time out to attend our webinar today. We look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Michelle, again, thank you. And with that, we'll close today's webinar. Have a great week, everyone.